In this lesson, we are going to talk about how to respond to describe prompts. So, describe prompts are prompts that ask you to share information about some topic. So here are examples. Describe a skill or hobby you learned at school that you find useful in your daily life. How do you use this skill or hobby outside of school? Explain how family roles and responsibilities are typically divided in your culture. How do these roles impact daily life? Explain the basic rules of a sport you are familiar with. How is the game played? And what are the main objectives? So as you can see in all three of these examples, there is some topic, a skill or hobby, family roles and responsibilities, basic rules of a sport, and you're asked to share information about that topic. Here's how to structure your responses to describe prompts. To start, answer the prompt as directly as possible, so don't use an introduction. And don't worry about a conclusion. This advice may be surprising to you, so let me explain further. Here's why you shouldn't use an introduction like any of the following. Today I'm going to discuss. This response is going to look at. This is a very interesting topic that I'm going to dive into in this response. These are all things that I've seen students use on the DET. However, I would not recommend using introductions like this because they are a waste of time. The questions on the DET are very short, and you want to use every second well to make sure that you are getting maximum points. So if you spend time writing introductions like this, you are taking away time from things that will gain you more points. And that's why introductions like this are a waste of time. Instead, you should answer the prompt as directly as possible. Let me illustrate this with some examples. So using the example prompts that we looked at before, I'm going to write some very strong first sentences. So describe a skill or hobby you learned at school that you find useful in your daily life. How do you use this skill or hobby outside of school? An example first sentence would be, a skill that I learned at school is how to research new topics and quickly learn about them. By starting my response with a very clear, direct sentence like this, I get right to the point, and it helps to organize the rest of my response because the reader knows my main point, so it's much easier to make sense of everything else I say or write in my response. Also notice how in this first sentence, I am borrowing language from the prompt itself, right? So I'm asked about a skill I learned at school that I find useful in my daily life, and I borrow a skill that I learned at school. So feel free to borrow language from the prompt because that makes it even clearer that you are responding directly to the prompt. All right, another example. Explain how family roles and responsibilities are typically divided in your culture. How do these roles impact daily life? Family roles in my culture are in the process of changing, and there is more and more diversity. And from the very first sentence here, you know the main point of my response and what I should talk about in the rest of it, explaining or elaborating how family roles are changing in my culture. And finally, explain the basic rules of a sport you are familiar with. How is the game played and what are the main objectives? Basketball is my favorite sport and I have played it for a long time. So we're asked to describe the rules of a sport, and the very first word in my response is the sport that I'm going to talk about, and then I include some information that I've played it for a long time and therefore I am familiar with the rules. All right, the second piece of advice that we looked at before was don't worry about a conclusion. If you have time, you can add one. However, if you don't have a conclusion, you won't lose many points, if any points. It's simply not very important for your response. Because there are far more important things that you can do and spend time on in your response than having a conclusion. So why are conclusions not so important? Well, conclusions don't add any new information to your response. They don't develop your ideas further or give you the opportunity to use new vocabulary. Also, on the DET, your responses are very short. The questions are very short, so your responses will be very short. And therefore, it's less important to have a conclusion in which you summarize your main points. If you have a very long essay, it's going to be hard for the reader to remember all of your points, and therefore a conclusion is going to be very helpful to them, to remind them of the main points of your essay. But here, the essay is so short that the reader can remember your main points, and so the value of a conclusion is not very much. Again, you can add a conclusion if you feel more comfortable doing that, but there are more valuable things that you can spend your time doing in your response that will gain you more points. Okay, let's get back to the list of things that you should do to structure your response. So we already looked at the first one, which is don't include an introduction. Instead, answer the prompt as directly as possible. Don't worry about a conclusion. And here are the rest of the aspects that you should aim to do in your response. Respond to all parts of the prompt. Duolingo wants to make sure that your response is relevant to the prompt that you are given. In other words, that your response answers the questions or addresses the prompt that you are given. So be sure that you carefully read the prompt and in your response, hit all of the aspects that you are asked to respond to. Stay on topic. Don't allow yourself to drift off topic and start to talk about things that are not related to the response. You want everything focused on the prompt that you are given. That's how you're going to get maximum points. Talk about one idea at a time. So keep your response neat and organized. Talk about one idea, then move on to the next idea, to the next idea like this. You want to avoid jumping around between ideas. That quickly makes your response confusing and it's going to lose you a lot of points. And finally, write strong paragraphs. This is such an important skill to develop, not just for the DET, but your writing in general. It's so important that we have a dedicated lesson about it, which you can watch after this one.